The rain did not just fall, it battered against the towering, floor-to-ceiling windows of Pendelton Manor with the fury of a slighted ghost. Thunder rattled the antique crystal chandeliers in the grand foyer, casting trembling, fractured shards of light across the cold marble floors. Chloe Pendelton, 24 years old and currently the reigning subject of the city's most vicious high society gossip columns, paced the length of the master suite. She was wrapped in a silk robe that cost more than her first car, though it brought her absolutely no comfort. The media had painted her with a broad, predictable brush, the vapid, beautiful former model who had finally sunk her manicured claws into Arthur Pendelton, one of the city's most elusive and exhausted billionaires. The ultimate trophy wife, they called her. The gold digger of the decade. If only they knew how incredibly boring the reality was. Their marriage, exactly 21 days old, was a business transaction executed with the cold efficiency of a corporate merger. Chloe's family estate and her father's generational shipping company had been teetering on the edge of utter financial ruin. Arthur Pendelton, 35 and perpetually plagued by a traditional, old-guard board of directors who demanded their CEO be a stable, settled family man, needed a wife. He needed someone who would look immaculate at galas, ask zero questions about his 80-hour work weeks, and sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement without batting an eyelash. Chloe had agreed. She saved her father, and Arthur secured his CEO position. Since the brief, highly orchestrated wedding, they had spoken perhaps a total of 500 words to each other. Arthur was a ghost in his own home, leaving before she woke and returning long after she had gone to sleep. And tonight, she was supposed to be completely alone. Arthur had flown out to Tokyo for a crucial 2-week summit. The massive, 30-room manor was entirely hers. Yet, Chloe couldn't sleep. The house was too big, too quiet, and too full of shadows. She walked over to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass, watching the lightning illuminate the sprawling, manicured grounds. She sighed, her breath fogging the pain. 2 weeks, she whispered to herself. I have 2 weeks to figure out how not to lose my mind in this museum. Miles away, the man she was currently thinking about was having the worst night of his adult life. Arthur Pendelton did not do chaos. He did itineraries, spreadsheets, private jets, and predictable outcomes. However, Mother Nature cared very little for his itineraries. His private flight to Tokyo had been grounded just before takeoff due to catastrophic engine failure. The storm that subsequently rolled in grounded all commercial alternatives. To make matters worse, his luggage had somehow been loaded onto a different cargo plane that was already halfway to London, his phone battery had died 3 hours ago, and his executive driver had been caught in a massive pileup on the interstate. Desperate to just sleep in his own bed, Arthur had hailed a ride-share. The driver, terrified of the torrential downpour and the intimidating iron gates of the Pendelton estate, had dropped him off at the bottom of the 2-mile-long private driveway. Arthur had been forced to walk. In the dark. In a hurricane-level downpour. By the time he reached the sprawling stone steps of his own home, he was unrecognizable. He had slipped twice in the mud, completely ruining his bespoke charcoal Armani trousers. His crisp white dress shirt was soaked through, plastered to his skin, and torn at the shoulder where he had snagged it on a stray branch. He had lost his tie entirely, and his usually perfectly styled hair was a chaotic, dripping mess plastered to his forehead. He had a smudge of dark mud across his cheekbone that looked remarkably like a severe bruise, and a small cut on his jaw from a thorny rose bush he had blindly walked into. He looked less like a Fortune 500 CEO and more like a man who had just escaped a maximum security prison. Shivering violently, Arthur huddled beneath the grand portico of the side entrance. He didn't want to use the main doors. He knew Chloe was inside, likely asleep in the massive master suite. He barely knew the woman he had married. She seemed polite but fragile, like a delicate porcelain doll meant only for display. If he rang the doorbell at 2 in the morning looking like a swamp creature, She would probably have a heart attack. Just get inside, go to the guest room in the West Wing, and deal with it tomorrow, he muttered to himself, his teeth chattering. He pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner next to the heavy oak door. The scanner flashed red. Unrecognized. Damn it, Arthur hissed. The mud and rainwater on his thumb were interfering with the laser. He wiped his hand on his soaking wet, equally muddy shirt and tried again. Red flash. Unrecognized. With a heavy sigh, Arthur flipped open the hidden panel below the scanner to reveal the manual keypad. His fingers were numb from the cold, and in his exhaustion, he punched in the secondary passcode. He heard the satisfying click of the deadbolt retracting, unaware that because he used the secondary code without disarming the main panel first, a silent alarm had just been triggered on the master control tablet inside the house. He pushed the door open, wincing as the hinges gave a soft, ominous creak. He stepped into the darkened hallway, peeling off his ruined, squeaky Italian leather shoes and leaving them on the priceless Persian rug. Upstairs, Chloe had finally laid down, staring at the ceiling, when the subtle vibration of her bedside table caught her attention. She turned her head. The digital security tablet, resting on the mahogany nightstand, was pulsing with a soft, urgent red light. Chloe sat up instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She snatched the tablet. Alert, breach. Side entrance West Wing. Silent alarm engaged. All the blood drained from her face. She was completely alone. She had dismissed the estate staff for the weekend, wanting privacy, and the external security detail only patrolled the perimeter gates. Someone was inside the house. A normal trophy wife, the kind the magazines insisted she was, would have locked the bedroom door, hidden in the massive walk-in closet, and called the police, weeping into the phone. But Chloe was not normal. She had grown up in the rough and tumble world of shipyards before her father made his millions. She knew how to handle herself, and more importantly, an intense, fiery surge of territorial protectiveness washed over her. This was her house now. No one was going to terrorize her in her own home. She didn't want to call the police yet. The response time in this secluded neighborhood was at least 20 minutes in a storm like this. The intruder could be upstairs by then. She needed to deal with this immediately. She slid out of bed, her bare feet making zero sound on the plush carpet. She bypassed her phone, not wanting the screen's glare to give her away. She needed a weapon. She scanned the opulent bedroom. Her eyes landed on an absolutely hideous, heavy bronze sculpture of a greyhound that Arthur's mother had gifted them as a wedding present. It weighed at least 10 pounds and had sharp, pointed ears. It was perfect. Gripping the bronze dog by its hind legs, Chloe slipped out of the master suite and into the cavernous, pitch-black hallway of the second floor. Downstairs, Arthur was shivering uncontrollably. The air conditioning in the manor was set to a crisp 68 degrees, which was usually refreshing, but to a soaking wet man, it felt like an Arctic tundra. He needed dry clothes, but his closet was in the master suite with Chloe. The only other place he kept a change of clothes was in his private study on the ground floor, locked behind a heavy oak door. He padded silently in his wet socks across the foyer, heading toward the east wing. He rubbed his temples, a massive migraine building behind his eyes. He just wanted a pair of sweatpants, a glass of scotch, and unconsciousness. Chloe crept down the sweeping grand staircase, pressing her back against the cold wall to avoid the creaky center steps. The storm outside flashed, throwing long, monstrous shadows across the floor. She paused, holding her breath. Squeak. Squish. The sound of wet socks on hardwood. It came from the hallway leading to the study. Chloe tightened her grip on the bronze greyhound. Her adrenaline was spiking, sharpening her senses. She moved with the fluid, silent grace of a predator, stepping into the corridor. At the end of the hall, she saw him. A towering, broad-shouldered silhouette of a man. He was covered in mud, his clothes torn and ruined. He looked disheveled, dangerous, and completely out of place in the pristine, multi-million-dollar hallway. He was hunched over the keypad of Arthur's private study, muttering aggressively under his breath. "Come on, you stupid machine," Arthur whispered, his numb fingers fumbling with the keys. He had typed the code in wrong twice already. "Just open." Chloe's mind raced. The man was trying to break into Arthur's secure office. That was where the private safe was. This wasn't a random break-in, this was a targeted burglary. The man was huge, clearly unhinged, and desperate. If he got inside that room, or worse, if he realized she was standing right behind him, he might attack her. She couldn't let him turn around. She had the element of surprise, and she was only going to get one chance at this. Taking a deep breath, Chloe took 3 rapid, completely silent steps forward, closing the distance between them. Arthur finally hit the right button. The keypad beeped green. "Thank God," he sighed in relief, leaning forward to turn the brass handle. He never even heard her coming. Chloe swung the heavy bronze greyhound with everything she had. She aimed for the back of his shoulder, not wanting to kill the man, just incapacitate him. But at the exact moment she swung, Arthur turned slightly to push the door open. Thwack! The solid bronze base of the statue connected squarely with the side of Arthur's head, right above his ear. Arthur's eyes went wide. A brilliant flash of white light exploded in his vision, followed instantly by a wave of suffocating darkness. He didn't even have time to register the pain or figure out what had hit him. He let out a muffled groan, his knees buckling instantly. Like a puppet with its strings cut, the billionaire CEO collapsed into a heap on the polished hardwood floor, completely out cold. Chloe stood over him, chest heaving, the bronze dog still raised above her head like a warrior goddess holding a severed head. She stared down at the massive, muddy intruder lying motionless at her feet. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating his face. Because of the mud, the wild hair, and the dark shadows, she still didn't recognize him. All she saw was a dangerous burglar who had made a terrible mistake. "Well," Chloe whispered into the empty hallway, her voice trembling slightly with residual adrenaline. "I guess I don't need to call the police just yet. First, we need to find some zip ties." Consciousness did not return to Arthur Pendelton gracefully. It clawed its way back through a thick, suffocating fog, heralded by the sensation of a marching band composed entirely of tiny, angry men clashing out of tune cymbals directly against the inside of his skull. He groaned, a low, gravelly sound that tasted like copper and dust. He tried to bring his hands up to massage his violently throbbing temples, only to find that his arms refused to move. Arthur blinked, his vision swimming in a blurry soup of shadows and dim, warm light. He blinked again, harder this time, forcing his eyes to focus. He was sitting upright. Actually, he wasn't just sitting, he was rigidly bound. The cold, unforgiving bite of industrial-grade nylon zip ties dug sharply into his wrists, which were pulled tight behind his back and secured to the thick, carved wooden rungs of a chair. His ankles were similarly bound to the chair's front legs. He shifted his weight, wincing as the movement sent a fresh spike of agony radiating from the spot just above his right ear. He recognized the feeling of the upholstery beneath him. It was crushed velvet. He was tied to one of the 12 custom-upholstered, 18th-century mahogany dining chairs in his own formal dining room, a room that, ironically, he had never actually eaten a meal in because he found it too ostentatious. What in the absolute hell is happening? Arthur thought, his brilliant, usually razor-sharp CEO brain struggling to process the data. He was freezing. His ruined dress shirt clung to his chest like a second skin of ice water, and he could smell the pungent, earthy scent of the mud that caked his trousers and face. The grand dining room was illuminated only by the faint, ambient glow of the security lights from the hallway and the occasional, jagged flash of lightning from the storm still raging outside. Then, he heard the sound. Tap. Drag. Tap. Drag. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply menacing rhythm. Arthur forced his heavy head up. Pacing in front of the massive, unlit stone fireplace at the far end of the room was his wife of 21 days, Chloe. She was wearing a floor-length, shimmering silver silk robe that made her look like an ethereal phantom in the dim light. But there was absolutely nothing ghostly or delicate about her posture. Her shoulders were squared, her chin was high, and in her right hand, she gripped a heavy, wrought iron fire poker. The tip of the poker scraped against the hardwood floor with every step she took. Tap. Drag. Chloe. Arthur croaked, his voice raw and raspy from the cold and the shock. She stopped pacing instantly. The fire poker snapped up, the heavy iron tip pointed directly at his chest. Her eyes, usually a soft, warm hazel, were wide, dilated with adrenaline, and completely merciless. She looked like a cornered lioness. "Do not speak," Chloe commanded, her voice remarkably steady, though Arthur could detect the faintest tremor beneath the steel. "You do not get to speak until I ask you a question. Nod if you understand." Arthur stared at her, utterly bewildered. Was this some bizarre, avant-garde sleepwalking episode? Was she having a night terror? "Chloe, what are you doing?" I said, "do not speak." She took a sudden, aggressive step forward, brandishing the iron rod. "I swear to God, I have already brained you once with a 10-pound bronze dog, and I will happily do it again with this poker if you don't shut your mouth." Arthur's mouth clicked shut. The blinding pain in his head suddenly made perfect sense. The hideous bronze greyhound his mother had insisted they display in the upstairs hallway. His new bride had bludgeoned him with a wedding present. He took a slow, rattling breath, trying to summon the authoritative, commanding tone that routinely brought tables of seasoned executives to heel. "Chloe. Look at me. Turn on the main lights and look at me. It is me. It's Arthur. I am your husband." Chloe let out a sound that was half scoff, half laugh, a cold, brittle sound entirely devoid of humor. She didn't reach for the light switch. Instead, she took another step closer, keeping a safe 6-foot distance, her eyes scanning his muddy, battered form with absolute disdain. "Nice try," she said smoothly. "Honestly, A for effort on doing your homework, but you are a terrible liar. Arthur Pendelton is currently somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, flying first class to Tokyo. He is not dripping swamp water onto my Persian rug." "My flight was grounded," Arthur insisted, testing the strength of the zip ties. "They didn't budge a millimeter." Where had she even found these? The engine blew out on the tarmac. The storm shut down the airport. I had to take a ride share, and the driver wouldn't come up the driveway, so I had to walk. In the mud. Chloe tilted her head, her expression one of mocking pity. "Walk? You expect me to believe Arthur Pendelton walked 2 miles in a hurricane? The man who has his assistant iron his shoelaces? The man who sends back bottled water if it's the wrong temperature? Please." Arthur would have called a private helicopter to airlift him to the front porch before he allowed a single drop of mud onto his Armani slacks. Arthur closed his eyes in sheer exasperation. "Is that really how she sees me?" he thought. "Well, to be fair, that is exactly what I would normally do." "My phone died," he gritted out, his patience beginning to fray at the edges. "I couldn't call anyone. I used the keypad at the side door." "Ah, yes. The phone." Chloe reached into the deep pocket of her silk robe and pulled out his sleek, top-of-the-line smartphone, now completely encased in a layer of dried mud. It was undeniably dead. She tossed it onto the massive mahogany dining table. "I found this in your pocket while I was tying you up. I assume you pickpocketed him at the airport before you decided to come rob his house? Or did you find it dropped in the driveway?" I didn't pickpocket myself, Chloe. Arthur strained against the ties, the absurdity of the situation finally boiling over into anger. This is ridiculous. Untie me right now. I have a concussion, I am freezing, and I am in no mood for this. Call security. Call William at the front gate. He'll tell you I walked past him. William is off duty, genius, Chloe snapped back, her grip tightening on the poker. The perimeter guards only do drive-bys on the hour during heavy storms. And I'm not calling anyone until I know exactly what I'm dealing with. She resumed her pacing, the iron tip scraping the floor again. Tap. Drag. Here is what is going to happen, Chloe announced, her tone shifting into a chilling, pragmatic cadence that Arthur had never heard her use before. During their brief courtship, she had been quiet, agreeable, and perfectly manicured. The woman standing before him now was a completely different creature. You are going to tell me exactly how many people you have waiting outside. If you tell me the truth, I will call the police, hand you over, and press simple breaking and entering charges. You'll do a few years, maybe get out on parole. She stopped and pointed the poker at his face. But if you lie to me, or if I find out you have friends lurking in my rose bushes waiting to ambush the cops, I will leave you tied to that chair, turn off the security system, and handle you myself before the police ever get here. Do you understand me? Arthur stared at her, genuinely stunned. The media called her a vapid trophy wife. His board of directors called her a safe, decorative asset. He had assumed she was just a beautiful, slightly tragic figure desperate to save her father's failing business. He had deeply, profoundly underestimated her. She wasn't cowering. She had incapacitated a man twice her size in the pitch dark, restrained him with terrifying efficiency, and was now conducting a hostage interrogation with the cold-blooded composure of a cartel boss. Despite his agonizing headache, his ruined clothes, and the humiliating reality of being tied to his own dining chair, a strange, utterly foreign feeling sparked in Arthur's chest. It was admiration. Pure, unadulterated admiration. He let out a short, breathy chuckle, which immediately made his head pound harder. You think this is funny? Chloe's voice dropped an octave, the poker lowering slightly as her confusion briefly overrode her anger. No, Arthur sighed, leaning his head back against the velvet chair. I think it's tragic. I paid a private security firm $200,000 to upgrade the perimeter defenses last year, and they are utterly useless. Meanwhile, my 24-year-old wife takes down intruders with interior decorating choices and plastic ties from the garage. Stop calling me your wife, Chloe warned, stepping closer. She was close enough now that Arthur could smell the faint, expensive lavender lotion she wore. Arthur's eyes are a much lighter blue than yours. And he doesn't have a beard. It's 5 o'clock shadow, Arthur argued tiredly. I've been traveling for 20 hours. And it's practically pitch black in here, how can you even see my eye color? Chloe, please. Just turn on the lights. If I turn on the main lights, anyone watching the house from the outside will know I'm awake and down here, she retorted instantly, her logic flawless. I'm not giving up my tactical advantage. Arthur couldn't help but smile, a genuine, albeit lopsided, expression. Tactical advantage? Where did you learn to think like this? Certainly not on the runway. Chloe's jaw tightened. My father ran shipping yards in South Boston before he made his money. I spent my childhood surrounded by longshoremen and dock workers. You learn a few things about leverage when you're a 12-year-old girl in a shipyard. She shook her head, as if annoyed with herself for giving away personal information to a criminal. Enough. How did you know the code to the side door? That keypad requires a 6-digit alphanumeric sequence. Because I created the sequence, Arthur said. It's my mother's maiden name followed by the year she died. Hayes 9-8. Chloe froze. The poker hovered in mid-air. For the very first time since Arthur had regained consciousness, a flicker of genuine doubt crossed her face. The passcode was not written down anywhere. It was not public knowledge. Arthur's mother's death had been heavily publicized, but her maiden name was obscure, buried in decades-old records. She stared at the muddy, bleeding man tied to the chair. She looked at his broad shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw beneath the dirt and scruff, the exasperated, tired slump of his posture. "Lucky guess," Chloe whispered, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself. "You did your research. You dug into his past to find a password." "Fine," Arthur challenged, shifting his bound wrists again to restore some blood flow to his fingers. "Test me. Ask me something only your husband would know. Ask me something about the 3 weeks we've known each other. Something that isn't on a Wikipedia page or in a gossip magazine." Chloe narrowed her eyes, stepping back into the shadows of the room, her mind racing. She was terrified of the possibility that this really was a violent criminal playing mind games, but an even deeper, more mortifying terror was beginning to bloom in her stomach. What if she had just brutally assaulted and zip-tied the CEO of Pendelton Industries, the man holding her family's financial future in his hands? "Okay," Chloe said slowly, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous dining room. "Let's play your game. If you are Arthur Pendelton, tell me what happened on our wedding night." Arthur raised a muddy eyebrow. "Are you referring to the incredibly awkward, silent car ride from the reception, or the part where I shook your hand in the foyer, told you the master suite was yours, and went to sleep in the guest wing because we both felt completely ridiculous?" Chloe swallowed hard. The poker dipped toward the floor. "Or," Arthur continued, his voice softening just a fraction, "are you referring to the conversation we had the next morning over coffee? When I handed you the final signed documents that bailed out your father's shipping company, and you looked at me and said..." He paused, his sharp memory pulling up the exact, vulnerable image of her from that morning. "You said, 'I promise I won't be a burden, Arthur. I'll just be a ghost.'" The fire poker clattered loudly as the iron tip hit the hardwood floor. Chloe's hands were shaking. Arthur looked at her, his blue eyes piercing through the gloom, holding no anger, only an immense, bone-deep weariness. "I didn't want a ghost, Chloe," he said quietly over the sound of the rain lashing against the windows. "I just wanted to go to sleep. Now, can we please find a pair of scissors?" The heavy iron fire poker lay abandoned on the polished hardwood, its sharp metallic clatter echoing through the cavernous dining room like a judge's gavel signaling a guilty verdict. Chloe stood frozen. The adrenaline that had been surging through her veins just seconds ago evaporated, replaced instantly by an icy, paralyzing wave of pure, unadulterated horror. "I didn't want a ghost, Chloe," the muddy, bleeding man tied to the chair had said. No one else knew about that conversation. It had taken place in the suffocating silence of the sunroom the morning after their wedding. There had been no staff present, no lawyers, no PR team. Just the two of them, a pot of untouched black coffee, and the heavy weight of a multi-million-dollar transactional marriage settling over their shoulders. Chloe stared at the man's face. The harsh shadows of the room and the thick layer of mud and rainwater had obscured his features, but now, looking closely at the sharp angle of his jaw, the straight slope of his nose, and the piercing, exhausted blue of his eyes. "Oh my God," Chloe whispered, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "Arthur." Arthur Pendleton let out a long, ragged exhale, his head falling back against the crushed velvet of the dining chair. "Yes, Chloe. For the love of all that is holy, yes. It is Arthur." "Oh my God," she repeated, her voice pitching up an octave in rising panic. She scrambled forward, dropping to her knees beside the chair, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering uselessly over the thick, industrial-grade plastic zip ties biting into his wrists. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I thought you were in Tokyo. You were supposed to be in Tokyo for 2 weeks. Why didn't you turn on the lights? Why did you sneak in like a thief? I didn't want to wake you, Arthur groaned, closing his eyes as a fresh wave of dizziness washed over him. My flight was grounded. My phone died. The gate guard was on patrol. I walked 2 miles in a monsoon. And my reward for trying to be a considerate husband was a 10-pound bronze greyhound to the skull. I thought you were trying to break into the safe in the study. Chloe defended herself, though her voice was trembling with guilt. She tugged frantically at the zip ties. They didn't budge. Arthur, I'm so sorry. I think I gave you a concussion. You definitely gave me a concussion, Arthur agreed dryly. Now, please, before I lose feeling in my hands permanently, go to the kitchen. Third drawer on the left of the island. There are heavy-duty kitchen shears. Chloe didn't need to be told twice. She bolted from the dining room, her bare feet slapping frantically against the cold marble floors of the hallway. She navigated the dark house purely on muscle memory, bursting into the massive, pristine chef's kitchen. She practically tore the drawer off its tracks, snatching the stainless steel shears, and sprinted back to the dining room. When she returned, Arthur hadn't moved. He looked pale beneath the grime, his chest rising and falling in shallow, measured breaths. Okay, hold still, Chloe instructed, her voice shaking. She knelt behind him. To get enough leverage to cut the thick plastic, she had to lean over him, her chest pressing slightly against his shoulder, her arms wrapping around his torso to reach his bound wrists. Arthur stiffened. Since their incredibly brief, highly choreographed wedding kiss, they had not touched. Not once. Now, she was practically wrapped around him, smelling of expensive lavender sleep lotion and sheer panic, while he smelled like a wet stray dog that had been dragged through a swamp. Don't cut my arteries, Chloe. I have a board meeting on Tuesday, Arthur muttered, trying to distract himself from the sharp ache in his head and the sudden, hyper-awareness of her proximity. I won't, she breathed, her jaw set in concentration. She wedged the blade of the shears under the tightly pulled plastic. This is going to pinch. With a sharp snap, the first tie gave way. Arthur let out a hiss of relief as blood rushed back into his right hand. A second snap, and his left hand was free. Chloe quickly moved to his ankles, severing those ties as well. Arthur slowly brought his hands forward, rubbing his raw, red wrists. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his head hanging between his shoulders as he waited for the room to stop spinning. Chloe stood beside him, clutching the shears to her chest, looking like a chastised child waiting for a scolding. Her mind was racing a mile a minute. This is it, she thought. He's going to divorce me. He's going to void the prenup under the gross misconduct clause. He'll throw me out into the storm, and my father's company will go bankrupt by Monday morning. Arthur, she started, her voice barely a whisper. If you want me to pack my things. I understand. I know I breached the terms of our arrangement by committing aggravated assault. Arthur slowly lifted his head, turning to look at her. The right side of his face was smeared with mud, and a slow trickle of dried blood trailed from his hairline, disappearing into the collar of his ruined Armani shirt. He didn't yell. He didn't demand his lawyers. Instead, he stared at her for a long, quiet moment, his expression utterly unreadable. Help me up, he said softly. Chloe blinked, surprised by the lack of rage. She quickly hooked her arm under his shoulder, bracing herself. Arthur leaned heavily against her as he stood. He was nearly a foot taller than her, broad-shouldered and solid, and despite the exhaustion practically radiating off him, Chloe realized with a jolt that her corporate robot husband was built like a brick wall. To the kitchen, Arthur instructed, his voice tight with pain. Turn the lights on. I don't care who sees. They hobbled together out of the dark dining room. When Chloe finally flipped the switch for the massive, modern kitchen, the sudden blast of bright, recessed lighting was merciless. Arthur squinted, shielding his eyes. Chloe gasped. In the dark, he had looked like a terrifying shadow. In the harsh kitchen light, he looked like a victim of a terrible accident. His clothes were shredded and plastered to his skin with mud. He was shivering violently, his lips tinged with blue, and the swelling above his ear where the statue had connected was already turning a nasty shade of purple. "Sit," Chloe commanded, suddenly abandoning her fear of divorce in favor of immediate triage. She guided him to one of the velvet upholstered bar stools at the kitchen island. "Do not move. I'll get the first aid kit from the master bathroom." By the time she returned with the white plastic kit, a warm, wet washcloth, and a glass of water, Arthur had managed to peel off his ruined, muddy suit jacket, letting it drop unceremoniously onto the pristine white tile floor. He was trying to unbutton his soaked dress shirt, but his fingers were trembling too much from the cold and the shock to manage the small pearl buttons. "Let me," Chloe said softly, stepping into his space. She gently swatted his hands away and efficiently unbuttoned the ruined shirt, peeling the freezing, wet fabric off his shoulders. Arthur watched her, captivated despite the pounding in his skull. The media had painted her as a delicate, useless socialite. His own lawyers had assured him she was pliant and passive. Yet here she was, radiating a calm, authoritative competence. "You really hit me with the greyhound?" Arthur asked, wincing as Chloe gently pressed the warm, wet washcloth to his face, wiping away the thick layer of mud from his cheek and jawline. "It was heavy, it was nearby, and it has very sharp ears," Chloe defended, keeping her eyes focused on her task to avoid looking at his bare chest. "And you should be grateful I didn't grab the fire poker first. Remind me to have my mother's wedding gifts locked in a secure vault," Arthur muttered. Chloe moved the washcloth to the side of his head, gently dabbing at the dried blood matting his hair. "This is going to sting," she warned, opening a small bottle of antiseptic. Arthur hissed through his teeth as the alcohol hit the open cut. "Christ, Chloe. You pack a punch." "I told you," she said, her tone softening as she worked carefully. "I grew up in the shipyards. My dad didn't have money for nannies. I was raised by mechanics and dock bosses. You learn how to throw a punch, how to spot a liar, and how to tie a knot that won't slip." "The zip ties," Arthur noted, genuinely impressed. "Where did you even find those?" "The garage. Beside the gardening shears." Chloe finished cleaning the wound and applied a neat, square bandage over the cut. She stepped back, looking at her handiwork. Arthur looked at her. Really looked at her. For the past 3 weeks, he had treated her like a highly expensive piece of furniture, something necessary for the house to look complete, but requiring no actual interaction. He had assumed she preferred it that way. He thought she wanted the black card, the mansion, and the status, without having to deal with the man attached to them. "Why didn't you hide?" Arthur asked quietly, the silence of the massive house pressing in around them. "When the alarm went off. You thought a violent criminal had broken in. A normal person would have locked the bedroom door, hidden in the closet, and called 911. Chloe looked down at the marble countertop, suddenly finding the veining in the stone fascinating. "The police take 20 minutes to get up here. And I don't know. I was angry." "Angry?" "Yes." Chloe looked up, her hazel eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce defiance. "Everyone looks at me like I'm a joke. The media, your board of directors, the staff. Even you, Arthur. You look at me like I'm a porcelain doll you bought to put on a shelf. But this is my house now, too. And when I thought someone was breaking in to steal from us, I wasn't going to cower in a closet and wait to be rescued." Arthur went perfectly still. The headache, the cold, the sheer absurdity of the night, all of it faded into the background. He stared at the fiercely protective, fiercely intelligent woman standing in his kitchen holding a bloody washcloth. "I don't think you're a joke, Chloe," Arthur said, his voice stripped of all its usual corporate polish. It was rough, honest, and vulnerable. "I think you are entirely terrifying. And I think I am incredibly lucky you are on my side." Chloe's breath hitched. A slow, warm flush crept up her neck, coloring her cheeks. It was the first genuine compliment he had ever given her. Not about her dress, or her hair, or her ability to smile for the cameras. He was complimenting her steel. "You're an idiot," she whispered, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her panic. "You're a brilliant CEO, and you're an absolute idiot. Who breaks into their own house?" Arthur let out a soft laugh, immediately bringing a hand up to hold his throbbing head. "A man who really just wanted to sleep in his own bed." The heavy, oppressive tension that had defined their relationship for the past 3 weeks shattered entirely, leaving behind something new. Something raw, unscripted, and entirely real. They were no longer the billionaire and the trophy wife. They were just Arthur and Chloe, two exhausted, misunderstood people sitting in a kitchen at 3 in the morning. "I'll go get you some dry clothes from the master suite," Chloe offered, stepping away from the island. "And maybe some ibuprofen. Do you want me to call a doctor?" "No," Arthur said firmly. "No doctors. If this gets out, my board will think I'm incompetent for getting bested by my own wife, and the press will have a field day. We keep this between us." Chloe nodded, a conspiratorial glint in her eye. "Deal. But you owe me." "Owe you? For what?" "Giving me a concussion." "For not leaving you tied to that chair until morning," she retorted smoothly, turning to head for the stairs. Before she could take 2 steps, a massive, booming crash echoed from the front of the house. The heavy oak double doors of the main entrance were thrown violently open, slamming against the interior walls with enough force to shake the floorboards. Chloe spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She instantly reached behind her on the counter, her hand blindly closing around the heavy handle of a cast iron frying pan. Arthur practically jumped off the stool, ignoring the wave of nausea, moving instinctively to step in front of Chloe, shielding her with his body. Heavy, hurried boots thundered across the marble foyer, heading straight for the light in the kitchen. "Mr. Pendelton! Mrs. Pendelton!" A panicked, gruff voice roared. Arthur slumped against the counter, letting out a groan that was half relief, half annoyance. "Put the frying pan down, Chloe. It's just security." The footsteps thundering down the grand hallway did not belong to a single person. It sounded like a small, highly trained militia was currently stomping mud and rainwater into the priceless Persian runners of Pendelton Manor. "Clear the east wing. Check the perimeter locks." A gruff, booming voice echoed through the cavernous house. It was a voice accustomed to barking orders over the sound of gunfire, not the gentle hum of a luxury smart fridge. Inside the blindingly bright kitchen, chaos reigned for 3 agonizing seconds. Chloe, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs, instinctively stepped back. Her hand, acting entirely on the survival instincts she had honed in the shipyards of her youth, blindly snatched the heaviest object on the marble counter, a 12-inch, solid cast iron frying pan. She raised it with both hands, her knuckles white, her stance wide and braced. Arthur, despite suffering from a minor concussion, a bleeding scalp, freezing temperatures, and an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, did not flinch away. Instead, he moved with a surprising, fluid grace. He stepped deliberately in front of Chloe, putting his broad, albeit half-naked and violently shivering, back to her. He raised his hands in a placating, defensive gesture, ready to shield his 24-year-old wife from whoever was about to burst through the arched kitchen doorway. Squeak. Squish. Thud. Three massive figures in black tactical gear rounded the corner, their heavy boots slipping slightly on the pristine white tile. At the helm was Vance, the estate's head of security. Vance was a terrifyingly large man, an ex-military contractor who took his job protecting the Pendelton estate with a level of seriousness usually reserved for nuclear launch facilities. Vance swept into the room, his tactical flashlight mounted on his hip, though the kitchen was already lit up like a surgical theater. His eyes darted rapidly, assessing the threat level in a fraction of a second. He saw the muddy footprints. He saw the discarded, ruined Armani jacket on the floor. He saw a beautiful woman in a shimmering silver robe wielding a frying pan like a gladiator. And then, he saw the man standing protectively in front of her. A man who was covered in swamp mud. A man who was missing his shirt. A man who had a violently purple, swollen knot on the side of his head, a fresh bandage taped over a cut, and deep, red indentations circling both of his wrists. Vance's hand dropped from the holster at his thigh. His jaw practically unhinged. The two guards flanked behind him froze, their tactical training entirely failing them in the face of the utterly bizarre tableau before them. Mr. Pendelton. Vance stammered, his booming voice suddenly reduced to a bewildered croak. He blinked, clearly wondering if he was hallucinating. Sir? Is that you? Arthur slowly lowered his hands. He let out a long, ragged sigh, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of a man who managed a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate but could not manage to walk through his own front door without causing an international incident. Hello, Vance, Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm and laced with his signature corporate deadpan. Good evening. Or, I suppose, good morning. Vance took a hesitant step forward, his eyes locked on the bloody bandage on Arthur's head and the glaring red ring around his left wrist. Sir, the silent alarm was tripped at the West Wing side entrance. The biometric scanner failed, and the manual override was engaged without disarming the primary grid. We assumed a hostile breach. Vance swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to Chloe, who was still hovering behind Arthur, the cast iron pan trembling slightly in her grip. Sir, we were told you were on a flight to Tokyo. What happened? Who did this to you? Are there hostiles in the house? Chloe stopped breathing. This was it. This was the moment. The adrenaline that had kept her standing completely evaporated, leaving her feeling hollow and dizzy. She slowly lowered the heavy pan to the marble counter with a dull clank. She stared at the broad expanse of Arthur's back. All he had to do was tell the truth. My wife assaulted me in the dark, tied me to a dining room chair with zip ties, held me hostage with a fire poker, and interrogated me. It was over. He would tell Vance to arrest her. The board of directors would have a field day. Her father's company would be plunged back into bankruptcy by noon tomorrow. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the inevitable wave of Arthur's righteous fury, preparing for him to point a trembling, accusatory finger at her. There are no hostiles, Vance, Arthur said smoothly. Chloe's eyes snapped open. She stared at the back of his head in absolute shock. Sir? Vance asked, clearly not believing a word of it. He gestured broadly to Arthur's battered state. With all due respect, Mr. Pendelton, you look like you were thrown out of a moving vehicle into a ravine. And your wrists, sir, were you restrained? Arthur didn't miss a beat. He crossed his arms over his bare, shivering chest, projecting an aura of absolute authority despite looking like a shipwreck survivor. My flight was grounded due to catastrophic engine failure, Arthur explained, his tone indicating that this was a perfectly normal Tuesday night occurrence. My luggage is in London. My phone is dead. I took a ride share, but the driver refused to brave the driveway, so I was forced to walk. In the dark. During a flash flood. He paused, offering Vance a thin, utterly unamused smile. As for my injuries, Vance, It turns out that the landscaping team has left several hazardous obstructions near the west wing. I slipped in the mud, fell into a particularly aggressive rose bush, and had a rather violent disagreement with a low-hanging oak branch. Vance frowned, clearly trying to mentally map out how an oak branch could cause perfectly symmetrical ligature marks on a man's wrists. And, the wrists, sir. I got tangled in some heavy-duty gardening netting, Arthur lied flawlessly, without a single stutter. It was quite a struggle to free myself. Mrs. Pendelton, thankfully, heard the commotion and came down to assist me with the first aid kit. She was just preparing to defend the kitchen from whoever tripped the alarm. Which, as it turns out, was me. Arthur turned slightly, gesturing to Chloe. "Isn't that right, darling?" Chloe's mouth was slightly open. She stared at Arthur's calm, muddy profile. He was lying. The meticulous, rule-abiding, scandal-hating CEO of Pendelton Industries was standing in his kitchen, bold-faced lying to his own head of security to protect the woman he had married exactly 3 weeks ago. "Why yes," Chloe managed to squeak out, finding her voice. She cleared her throat, trying to channel her best aristocratic, unbothered tone. "Yes. My husband had a terrible fall. It was very traumatic for the rose bushes." Vance looked from Arthur to Chloe, and then down to the muddy clothes on the floor. It was the most absurd, flimsy cover story he had ever heard in his 20 years of security detail. But Arthur Pendelton was the man who signed his very lucrative paychecks. If the boss wanted to claim he was beaten up by a tree and restrained by gardening netting, Vance was not going to push the issue. "I see, sir," Vance said slowly, nodding. "Well, I apologize for the intrusion. We will, speak to the landscaping team immediately about the netting. Do you require a medical professional to be dispatched to the estate?" "No, Vance," Arthur said firmly. "Mrs. Pendelton has it entirely under control. I just want to go to sleep. Please secure the perimeter, lock the front doors, and stand down the alert. I will see you on Monday." "Yes, Mr. Pendelton." "Glad you are safe, sir. Have a good evening, Mrs. Pendelton." Vance gave a stiff, awkward bow, signaled to his two very confused tactical guards, and swiftly exited the kitchen. The heavy, rhythmic sound of their boots retreated down the hall, followed by the distant, echoing thud of the massive front doors closing and locking. Silence descended upon the kitchen once more. It was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the tall windows and the low hum of the refrigerator. Chloe stood glued to the spot. Her hands were shaking again, but this time, it wasn't from fear of an intruder. It was from the sheer, overwhelming weight of what had just happened. Arthur slowly turned around to face her. The adrenaline of dealing with Vance was fading, and his shoulders slumped. He leaned his hips against the marble island, crossing his arms over his chest again to ward off the chill of his wet trousers. He looked at her, his blue eyes tired but incredibly sharp. Chloe couldn't hold it in any longer. The guilt, the absurdity, the relief, it all boiled over. "Why did you do that?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly. She took a step toward him, dropping the aristocratic facade entirely. "Why did you lie to him? I assaulted you. I tied you up like a farm animal. You could have told him the truth. You could have voided the prenup right there. Why didn't you turn me in?" Arthur just looked at her. He looked at her tangled hair, her wide, panicked hazel eyes, and the defensive way she held her shoulders. He remembered how she had stood in the dark dining room, wielding a fire poker to defend his house. He remembered the gentle, careful way she had cleaned the blood from his temple just minutes ago. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some logical, corporate excuse about avoiding a PR scandal or not wanting to deal with police paperwork at 3 in the morning. But before he could say a word, a sound bubbled up in his chest. It started as a small, breathy scoff. Then, his shoulders began to shake. He brought a hand up to cover his mouth, trying to suppress it, but it was useless. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the entire evening finally crashed into him. Arthur Pendelton, the stoic, unmoving titan of industry, threw his head back and began to laugh. It wasn't a polite, restrained chuckle. It was a deep, chest-shaking, genuine roar of laughter. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the kitchen, bright and rich. He laughed until his eyes watered, clutching his ribs, wincing as the movement aggravated his bruised head, but he couldn't stop. "Arthur?" Chloe asked, taking a hesitant step back, genuinely concerned she had caused permanent brain damage with the bronze greyhound. Are you having a stroke?" "Gardening netting." Arthur gasped, leaning heavily onto the island for support, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "I told a former Navy SEAL that I was held hostage by gardening netting, and he had to stand there and pretend to believe me." Chloe stared at him. For 3 weeks, she had never seen this man smile, let alone laugh. He was always so tightly wound, so deeply buried under the weight of his responsibilities. Seeing him like this messy, bruised, half-naked, and laughing uncontrollably in the middle of the night was entirely disarming. Slowly, the tension drained out of Chloe's shoulders. The absolute ridiculousness of the situation caught up with her, too. "You told him you lost a fight with an oak tree," Chloe pointed out, a reluctant, hesitant smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I panicked." Arthur laughed, running a hand through his damp, chaotic hair. "What was I supposed to say?" "Sorry, Vance, my wife thought I was a cat burglar and hit me with my mother's hideous bronze dog. He would have called the psychiatric ward for both of us." "To be fair," Chloe retorted, crossing her arms, her smile growing wider, "you looked exactly like a swamp monster. And you were picking the lock to the safe room. I was fully justified in my tactical response." "Tactical response," Arthur repeated, shaking his head in sheer amusement. He finally managed to catch his breath, though a broad, genuine smile remained firmly planted on his face. He looked at her, the laughter fading into something much softer, much warmer. "You are a menace, Chloe Pendelton." It was the first time he had said her full married name without it sounding like a legal obligation. It sounded nice. It sounded like it belonged to her. "And you are an idiot," Chloe shot back softly, the earlier fear entirely replaced by a strange, comfortable camaraderie. "I am," Arthur agreed easily, without a trace of his usual ego. He pushed himself off the counter, suddenly very aware of how cold he was again. "And this idiot is freezing, starving, and in desperate need of a shower. Since you technically owe me your life for not throwing you to the wolves, do you think you could find me a pair of dry sweatpants?" Chloe let out a soft, genuine laugh of her own. "I think I can manage that. But only if you promise not to sneak up on me in the dark ever again." "I promise," Arthur said softly, his eyes locking onto hers. "No more ghosts. No more sneaking around." They stood there for a moment, the vast, echoing distance that had separated them for the last 3 weeks completely shattered. The arranged marriage was dead, beaten to death by a bronze greyhound and buried under a pile of ridiculous lies. What remained in its place was something entirely new, something built on mutual respect, shared absurdity, and a very genuine spark of connection. "Sweatpants," Chloe finally said, breaking the spell, though her voice was warm. "And then, I am making you a frozen pizza. Because I am not cooking a gourmet meal at 3 in the morning." Arthur grinned, the expression making him look 10 years younger. "A frozen pizza sounds like a Michelin star meal right now." As Chloe turned to head upstairs to retrieve his clothes, Arthur watched her go, a profound sense of relief washing over him. For the first time in his meticulously planned, incredibly stressful life, Arthur Pendelton was genuinely glad that his perfectly organized schedule had completely fallen apart. The grand, sweeping staircase of Pendelton Manor had always felt like a museum exhibit to Chloe. Walking up its wide, carpeted steps for the past 3 weeks, she had usually felt like a trespasser in her own life, a ghost haunting a house that belonged to a man she didn't know. But tonight, as she climbed the stairs, the cold marble beneath her bare feet felt undeniably real. The lingering scent of rain, mud, and the metallic tang of adrenaline followed her. Her hands were still trembling, just slightly, but the overwhelming, suffocating anxiety that had plagued her since her wedding day was completely gone. In its place was a strange, bubbling sense of disbelief, mixed with a sudden, sharp clarity. She reached the massive master suite. The bed, unmade on her side, looked ridiculous now. She bypassed it entirely and walked into Arthur's adjoining walk-in closet. It was the closet of a man who lived his entire life in a corporate cage. Row upon row of bespoke Armani, Tom Ford, and Brioni suits hung in perfect, color-coordinated precision. Crisp white shirts, pressed so sharply they could probably cut glass, lined the shelves. Dozens of silk ties, carefully rolled, sat in velvet-lined drawers. It was an intimidating, sterile display of wealth and power. Chloe sighed, running a hand through her tangled hair. "Where does a billionaire hide his sweatpants?" she muttered to herself. She opened 3 drawers of expensive, identical cashmere sweaters before finally hitting gold in the very bottom drawer of the furthest dresser. Hidden away, as if they were a shameful secret, was a small stack of worn, heather gray cotton sweatpants and a few plain, tagless black t-shirts. They looked soft. They looked worn in. They looked like clothes that belonged to an actual human being, not a CEO. Grabbing the softest pair of pants and a t-shirt, Chloe grabbed a thick, clean towel from the master bathroom and headed back downstairs. Down in the kitchen, the adrenaline had completely abandoned Arthur Pendelton, leaving him with the physical wreckage of the night. He was standing over the massive, gleaming stainless steel farmhouse sink, letting the warm water run over his hands. He splashed a handful of water onto his face, wincing as it dragged across the cut on his jaw, and then stared at his reflection in the dark, rain-streaked window above the sink. He looked like a disaster. The bandage on his temple was holding, but the skin around it was blossoming into a violent shade of purple. His chest was covered in goosebumps, his wet trousers were clinging miserably to his legs, and his hair was sticking up in 10 different directions. Yet, as he stared at his battered reflection, Arthur realized something shocking: he hadn't felt this awake in 10 years. For a decade, ever since his mother passed away and the weight of Pendelton Industries had been dropped squarely onto his shoulders, he had been operating on autopilot. He was a machine built to appease a demanding board of directors, a man who measured his worth in quarterly profits and stock valuations. He had married Chloe the exact same way he executed a hostile takeover, with cold, calculated efficiency, ensuring all liabilities were covered and the contract was ironclad. He had expected her to be a beautiful, silent accessory. He had expected to continue his miserable, exhausting life exactly as it was, just with a ring on his finger to keep the board happy. Instead, his wife had bludgeoned him with a wedding present, tied him to a chair, interrogated him with the ruthless cunning of a seasoned detective, and then smoothly lied to his head of security to protect him. A slow, genuine smile spread across Arthur's bruised face. "I couldn't find your monogrammed silk pajamas," a voice announced from the doorway. Arthur turned. Chloe was standing there, the heavy silver silk of her robe catching the bright kitchen lights. She held out a stack of clothes and a towel. Her expression was guarded, but the fierce, defensive edge from the dining room had softened entirely. "Thank God," Arthur said, accepting the clothes. The cotton felt like heaven against his freezing hands. "If you had brought me silk, I might have actually used the frying pan on myself." Chloe smiled, a small, genuine curving of her lips that transformed her entire face. It was the first time Arthur had seen her smile without the presence of a flashing camera or a society photographer. It hit him squarely in the chest, a sudden, unfamiliar flutter that had absolutely nothing to do with his concussion. "The downstairs powder room is just down the hall," Chloe pointed. "Go shower. Get the swamp water off you. I'll see what I can do about food." 15 minutes later, Arthur emerged from the bathroom. He had taken the fastest, hottest shower of his life. The grime was gone, though the hot water had made his bruised ribs and aching head throb with renewed vigor. He had dressed in the gray sweatpants which hung low on his hips and the plain black t-shirt. The soft cotton felt like an absolute luxury after hours in a freezing, wet dress shirt. He towel-dried his hair, abandoning any attempt to style it, letting it fall messily across his forehead. When he walked back into the kitchen, he stopped dead in his tracks. The pristine, sterile kitchen, a room that had previously only been used by the private estate chefs to prepare perfectly portioned, macro-balanced meals, was in a state of controlled chaos. Chloe had her hair tied up in a messy, chaotic bun using what looked like a stray chopstick. The sleeves of her wildly expensive silk robe were rolled up to her elbows. The massive, double-door Sub-Zero freezer was wide open, and she was standing on her tiptoes, aggressively rummaging through the back shelves. "I know it's in here," she muttered, pulling out a vacuum-sealed bag of organic edamame and tossing it onto the counter with a look of pure disdain. "If the chef threw it out, I am going to fire him. I don't care how good his coq au vin is." Arthur leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest, thoroughly enjoying the view. "What exactly are we looking for? Because if you're trying to find the caviar, it's in the smaller fridge. Do I look like a woman who wants caviar at 4 in the morning?" Chloe shot back, tossing a frozen block of wild-caught salmon onto the counter next to the edamame. "I am looking for the emergency stash." With a triumphant gasp, she reached into the very back corner of the bottom freezer shelf and pulled out a brightly colored, aggressively commercial cardboard box. She turned around, holding it up like a hard-won trophy. It was a frozen, stuffed crust pepperoni pizza. Arthur stared at it. In the entire time he had owned this house, he was fairly certain a processed carbohydrate had never crossed the threshold. "Where on earth did you get that?" "I smuggled it in," Chloe admitted shamelessly, walking over to the oven and punching the preheat buttons. 3 days after the wedding. "I realized that your chef only cooks things that are steamed, green, or require a dictionary to pronounce. I bribed one of the maids to buy this for me at a gas station. I was saving it for an emergency." She paused, looking at Arthur's bruised face, his messy hair, and the plain t-shirt. "I think surviving a home invasion by your own husband counts as an emergency." Arthur let out a soft laugh, walking fully into the room. He bypassed the formal bar stools and walked straight over to where Chloe was struggling to tear the plastic wrapping off the frozen pizza. He gently reached out, taking the box from her hands. "Allow me. I may not know how to bypass my own security system, but I can open a box." Chloe stepped back, giving him room. She watched as he efficiently unwrapped the pizza and slid it onto a baking sheet. There was something incredibly intimate about the domesticity of the moment. This man controlled thousands of employees and billions of dollars, yet here he was, in sweatpants, cooking a $5 gas station pizza in an oven that cost more than most people's cars. 20 minutes, Arthur announced, setting the timer and leaning back against the counter, right next to her. "So," Chloe said, the silence of the kitchen suddenly feeling a little too loud. 20 minutes. What do we do now?" Arthur looked around the kitchen. He looked at the massive marble island, the formal dining room through the archway where the zip ties were still lying on the floor, and the incredibly uncomfortable modern seating area by the windows. "We sit," Arthur said simply. He slid his back down the side of the wooden kitchen cabinets, dropping down until he was sitting cross-legged on the cold tile floor. He patted the space next to him. "Have a seat, Mrs. Pendelton." Chloe stared at him, genuinely shocked. You want to sit on the floor? Arthur, we have 32 chairs in this house. I know, because I counted them last Tuesday when I was bored. I spent the last 2 hours tied to one of them, Arthur pointed out dryly. I have developed a temporary aversion to furniture. Sit. Please. Chloe hesitated for only a second before gathering the heavy silk of her robe and sinking gracefully onto the floor beside him. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their backs against the cabinets, staring out at the gleaming, empty expanse of the kitchen. Outside, the storm had finally begun to break, the heavy rain reducing to a soft, rhythmic drizzle against the glass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. But unlike the suffocating, awkward silences that had defined their 3-week marriage, this silence felt entirely different. It felt like the deep, exhausted breath you take after running a marathon. It felt safe. I hated our wedding day, Arthur said quietly, breaking the silence. He didn't look at her, he just stared at the oven light. Chloe pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I know. Me too. It felt like a boardroom meeting, Arthur continued, his voice rough. There were 400 people there, and I think I actually liked maybe 3 of them. The press, the photographers, the board members breathing down my neck to make sure I looked the part of the stable, settled CEO. I hated every second of it. He turned his head, his blue eyes meeting hers in the dim light. But the part I hated the most was the look on your face. Chloe's breath hitched. My face. You looked terrified, Arthur said softly. You hid it well. The cameras didn't catch it. The magazines called you radiant. But when you walked down that aisle, and when you signed that prenup in my lawyer's office, you looked like you were walking to the gallows. You looked at me like I was the executioner. Chloe looked down at her bare feet, her throat tightening. You weren't the executioner, Arthur. You were the ransom. My father, he's a proud man. But he made some terrible investments. He leveraged the shipyards, the house, everything. If I hadn't married you, he would have gone to prison for fraud. He would have lost everything he built from nothing. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look back up at him. I wasn't terrified of you. I was terrified of what I was giving up. I was 24, and I felt like I had just sold my entire life to a stranger to pay off a debt. I thought my life was over. I thought I was just going to be a piece of the furniture in this massive, empty house. Arthur's jaw tightened. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently placing his large, warm hand over hers. His thumb brushed against her knuckles. You are not a piece of furniture, Chloe, Arthur said, his voice fierce and steady. And you are not a ransom. I know the terms of our arrangement. I know the lawyers made it entirely transactional. But sitting here tonight, watching you fight for this house, watching you hold your own against me, and against Vance. He shook his head, a look of profound realization crossing his battered face. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who agree with me because they are paid to. I am surrounded by yes men, sycophants, and people who only see my bank account. Tonight, you looked right past all of it. You didn't care about the money or the title. You just saw a threat, and you handled it. You are the most real thing that has happened to me in 10 years. Chloe's heart was hammering against her ribs, but this time, it had absolutely nothing to do with fear. The warmth of his hand over hers was grounding, sending a slow, electric current traveling up her arm. You aren't a robot, either, Chloe whispered, a small, teasing smile breaking through her emotional confession. The magazines call you the Ice King of Wall Street. But the Ice King wouldn't sit on the floor in sweatpants, eating a gas station pizza, after his wife gave him a concussion. Arthur chuckled, the sound deep and warm. The Ice King is currently deeply humbled and incredibly hungry. Beep. 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 The oven timer pierced the quiet intimacy of the moment. Chloe scrambled up from the floor, suddenly eager to break the heavy emotional tension before she started crying. She grabbed an oven mitt and pulled the pizza out. The edges of the crust were perfectly golden, the pepperoni was sizzling, and the cheap cheese was bubbling. To two exhausted, emotionally drained people, it smelled better than a five-star meal in Paris. She slid it onto a cutting board, haphazardly sliced it into slightly uneven triangles with a chef's knife, and brought the entire board down to the floor, placing it between them. Bon appétit, Chloe said, grabbing a hot slice and taking a massive bite. She groaned in pure, unadulterated appreciation. Oh my God. It's so bad, but it's so good. Arthur grabbed a slice, blowing on it gently before taking a bite. He closed his eyes, chewing thoughtfully. It tastes like cardboard, grease, and sodium. It is absolutely phenomenal. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the sheer absurdity of their makeshift floor picnic washing over them. They were a billionaire and a former high society model, sitting on the cold tile of a multi-million-dollar mansion at 5 in the morning, devouring a frozen pizza as if they hadn't eaten in weeks. So, Arthur said, wiping a spot of grease from the corner of his mouth with his thumb. Where do we go from here? Chloe paused, a piece of crust halfway to her mouth. What do you mean? The arrangement, Arthur clarified, turning to face her fully. The rules we set. We agreed to live separate lives under the same roof. We agreed to be a public partnership and a private nullity. We agreed you would be a ghost. He reached out, gently pulling the slice of pizza from her hand and setting it back on the board so he could have her full attention. I am officially voiding that contract, Chloe, Arthur said softly, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I don't want a ghost. I don't want a business partner. I don't want a polite stranger living in my house. Chloe's stomach did a nervous, fluttering flip. What do you want, Arthur? I want the woman who hits first and asks questions later, he said, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. I want the woman who smuggles junk food into my pristine kitchen. I want the woman who isn't afraid to yell at me, who isn't afraid to lie to my security team to protect me, and who is brave enough to sit on the floor with me when everything falls apart. He reached out, his hand gently cupping the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, his touch impossibly tender for a man with such bruised and battered hands. I want to start over, Arthur whispered. No lawyers. No press. No board of directors. Just Arthur and Chloe. Hi. I'm Arthur. I'm a workaholic with a concussion, I have terrible luck with weather, and I am very, very glad I married you. Chloe's eyes filled with sudden, hot tears. She didn't try to stop them. A single tear escaped, tracking down her cheek, right over his thumb. She leaned into his touch, the last heavy, protective walls around her heart crumbling completely to the floor. She let out a wet, watery laugh, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. Hi, Arthur, Chloe whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. I'm Chloe. I have a terrible temper, I hoard frozen food, and I am incredibly sorry I hit you with a bronze dog. Arthur smiled, leaning in. He didn't rush. He gave her every opportunity to pull away. But Chloe didn't move. She tilted her chin up, her eyes fluttering shut. When his lips finally met hers, it was nothing like the stiff, orchestrated, sterile kiss they had shared at the altar for the cameras. This kiss was incredibly soft, hesitant, and breathtakingly real. It tasted like cheap pizza, adrenaline, and the sudden, overwhelming promise of a completely new beginning. Arthur's hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling gently in the messy knot of her hair, pulling her just a fraction closer. Chloe let out a soft sigh against his lips, her hands finding the soft cotton of his t-shirt, resting flat against his chest. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palms. They broke apart slowly, resting their foreheads together, breathing in the quiet air of the kitchen. Outside, the first faint, pale streaks of dawn were beginning to break through the heavy, lingering storm clouds, casting a soft, blue-gray light through the towering windows. The storm was over. Arthur pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression lighter, younger, and happier than it had been in years. "So," Arthur murmured, his thumb brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Since we are officially starting over, does this mean we have to go on a honeymoon?" Chloe laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Absolutely not. The last time you tried to go to an airport, you ended up battered, bruised, and tied to a chair. I think we need to stay inside for at least a month for your own safety." Arthur wrapped his arm securely around her waist, pulling her close against his side as they sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by pizza crusts and the remnants of the longest night of their lives. "I think I can live with that," Arthur said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head as the sun finally rose over Pendelton Manor. "I think I can definitely live with that."